Want to keep up with the latest LEGO Maker 96.1 videos? Make sure to subscribe and ring that bell. Hello everyone, LEGO Maker 96.1 here with another video. And welcome back to another On This Day in History. It was on this day in history from July 1st to the 3rd of 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg was underway. The battle lasted from the 1st of July all the way to the 3rd, marking a Union victory and a turning point in the American Civil War. The Gettysburg Campaign started in June of 1863 after the Confederacy was winning a string of victories across the South against the Army of the Potomac. Now, the Confederate Army in Northern Virginia, commanded by Robert E. Lee, crosses the Potomac River to begin their second invasion of the North. The first invasion was at Antietam, but that'll be a topic for another video. Now, later on in that same month, the Union Army of the Potomac, now under the command of George Gordon Meade, pursued Lee across Maryland and onward into Pennsylvania. Now, there's a story on how Meade became the Army of the Potomac's commander. Now, the Union Army of the Potomac was going through commanders left and right. Irvin McDowell got his behind whoop at Bull Run, or Manassas, as our Southern boys call it. But McClellan was incompetent. Burnside did jack. In other words, he got more men killed. Hooker lost at Chancellorsville. And Lincoln accepted his resignation from the Army of the Potomac and was transferred elsewhere. Now, when a staff officer came to Meade's tent when he was in command of the 5th Corps of the Army of the Potomac, he thought he was getting arrested for something he did during the war. But that wasn't the case, you see. It was there that Meade became the commander of the Army of the Potomac. And with that in mind, he began to pursue Robert E. Lee through Maryland and onward into the state of Pennsylvania. Now, the first Union unit arrived in Gettysburg, and that was cavalry. Union cavalry under the command of John Buford. Now, he and his troops would set up defensive positions after he saw Confederate troops in Gettysburg. Now, these troops were with Heath's division of Hill's Corps. Now, he would send word to Meade that the Confederates are massing in Gettysburg, and he calls on Union support. Now, John F. Reynolds, who was in command of the 1st Corps, went right away. And the 11th Corps, which was, I believe, under the command of Oliver Otis Howard, would mobilize his troops and move with all possible speed to Gettysburg. Now, those were the 2 Union corps that arrived on Gettysburg, but the rest of the army would follow suit. The first 2 corps were the 1st and 11th Corps. Now, the battle was underway when a Union officer grabbed a carbine from a soldier, and he fired a shot at a Confederate soldier, thus beginning the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, there was some debate on how the battle took place. Well, the beginning of the battle, many of the Confederates thought they were going into town to get shoes, because many Confederates went into battle without shoes, or socks for that matter, because many of these guys were barefoot. That's the reason why we've seen movies of Confederate soldiers rifling through the dead, the dying, and the wounded, taking everything off of them. They would take their clothes, their equipment, their hats, their gear, and even their shoes too, because the South was running out of supplies during that time. They're running out of men, supplies, you name it. Now, the first day, the Confederate troops would march towards Gettysburg, and they will hold off. Now, Buford's men held off until Reynolds and the infantry would arrive. Now, Buford was stationed on top of the cupola on the first day. Oh, a little heads up, I'm going to go over all 3 days in one video because I'm not going to go through the trouble of making separate videos going over 3 separate days of the Gettysburg battle. This is going to be one full video. So there's that. Now, when Buford saw Reynolds on horseback riding up towards the Lutheran seminary, Reynolds called up to him and said, "What goes, John?" And he told him that there's a devil to pay. By devils, he means the Confederates, the Johnnies. Reynolds asked him, "Can you hold?" And Buford replied, "I reckon I can." And soon then, infantry support got right underway. Reynolds was leading troops of the famed Iron Brigade, those fellas with the tall black army hats, the hardy hats. And he was leading his troops in the woods just somewhere out of Gettysburg. His last words were, "Forward, for God's sakes, forward," until a Confederate soldier fired a shot at the back of Reynolds' head, killing him. Now, Reynolds would be one of the Union generals to die at Gettysburg. In fact, he would be one of many Union generals to die during the American Civil War. And during that fighting, the Confederates were trying many attempts to get through the Union lines. For example, one Union regiment was completely cut off from the rest of the army, and that unit was the 16th Maine. And knowing surrender was imminent, these guys, they tore down their state and national colors, tear them apart, and distribute the pieces to the men. And they took those pieces with them to Confederate prisons. You didn't know that, did you? Now, another reason was the railroad cut. I should know because I took a picture of the railroad cut when I was at Gettysburg for a day trip. And I could imagine right there soldiers of the Iron Brigade clashing with Confederate soldiers. It was a brutal hand-to-hand melee. And not only Iron Brigade was there, but soldiers of the 14th Brooklyn and state militia were there as well. Now, these guys were known as the Red-Legged Devils because they wore red trousers because of their uniform. The 14th Brooklyn Sacheers. Now, if you see pictures of these guys, they wore like red and blue kepis, fancy coats, red trousers, you name it. But unfortunately, the Confederates would soon overwhelm the Union forces, and they would push the Federals through the town and on towards the hills overlooking the town and the fields. And thus, the Confederates would win day one of the battle. Day two, on the other hand, was also crucial. It was there they would attack the Union forces on both flanks. That would be Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, Culp's Hill, the Wheat Field, and many other places. Now, most significantly, at the left end of the Union flank was Little Round Top. Now, Little Round Top didn't get its name during the battle. It got its name after the Battle of Gettysburg. It was known as Yonder Hill by the Federals or the Little Rocky One by the Confederates, quoted by Robert E. Lee. Now, coming up towards Little Round Top, they were under the command of the Signal Corps. These were soldiers that would have flags that would use like Morse code at the time because telegraph wires were being cut down by Confederates, so that way they wouldn't get messages out. It was also there that soldiers of the 5th Corps would arrive to take positions on Little Round Top. Now, earlier before, a man by the name of Gouverneur K. Warren rode up and saw the hill occupied by Signal Corps, and he knew that he needed troops because that flank of the Union Army, the left flank, was open, and the Confederates could just sweep up over the hill and take the flank by surprise. If they did that, Gettysburg would end it in a Confederate victory, and the tide of the war would change right then and there. Now, coming up were men and of the 5th Corps. Now, these were fellas. The 3rd Brigade was under the command of Strong Vincent, who was a colonel of the 3rd Brigade of the 5th Corps, or 1st Division of the Army of the Potomac. Now, these 3 famous regiments, or 4 famous regiments, my mistake, they took position on Little Round Top to counter the Confederates. Now, these fellas were the 20th Maine, the 83rd Pennsylvania, 44th New York, and 16th Michigan. Now, previous battle plans had the 83rd Pennsylvania, 16th Michigan, and 14th Brooklyn, not 14th, but 44th New York stationed on Little Round Top. But one of the colonels of the 44th would swap up their regiment with the 16th because the 83rd Pennsylvania and 44th New York fought side by side on every battle. So that's the reason why they're positioned there. Now, as to the Confederate regiments who attacked Little Round Top, these were the 4th and 5th Texas, 4th, 15th, and 47th Alabama. 5 Confederate regiments attacked Little Round Top. Now the Johnnies came at the Union troops wave after wave after wave, but still, these guys fought on and refusing to not give an inch. Now, mind you, while the Federal troops were fighting, they were also running low on ammunition and men. Those that were still alive were pocketing through the dead, the dying, and the wounded, gathering ammunition to replenish their ammunition to counterattack, as was seen in the movie Gettysburg from 1993. Now, knowing they wouldn't last another second longer, Chamberlain, who was in command of the 20th Maine, counterattacked by ordering a bayonet charge down Little Round Top and sending the Confederates running. Now, his actions on that day awarded him the Congressional Medal of Honor. Now, as to wondering about the officer who pointed a revolver at Chamberlain, yes, that did happen. The officer pointed his revolver at Chamberlain and pulled the trigger, but nothing. So Chamberlain pointed his sword at the officer, which he reversed his arms and proclaimed himself prisoner. Now, even though Little Round Top was a Union victory, the second day ended in a draw. Oh, I forgot to mention this for day 1 as well. There was also a veteran from the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War by the name of John Burns. Now, this guy was in his late 70s. He came out into battle demanding to serve. Now, he was outdated as well. He wore an out-of-date uniform, and he was also carrying a flintlock musket. Now, he would find himself a Union regiment and fought alongside these fresh young men in battle. Although he would be wounded, he was lucky enough to escape and lay low until the Confederates were gone. Now, John Burns at the time, he was a hero. And I tell you, that guy got guts, literally. Now, day 3 was the climax of the battle. And that climax was Pickett's charge. Now, it wasn't called Pickett's charge at the time. It was called sometime after the battle. Now, this was a full frontal assault by the Confederates. But there was also a downside to that as well, because 2 things played out in that fight at Gettysburg. One of them being the Union was fighting on home soil, which was they were defending their country, and the other reason, because they were holding the high ground. Anakin's weakness. Bastards. Now, at the beginning, Pickett had a bombardment at the Union Center, which was the stone wall. Now, more on that story later on in this video. Now, thinking that the Union troops were somewhat defeated, infantry support was underway, but still, artillerymen and seeing the Confederates coming were somewhat in awe, and knowing that they were being attacked, they would open fire with canister and later grape shot. Canister, mind you, was this sack that were packed with tin iron balls that would burst in the air over the troops, thus turning the cannon into a giant shotgun. Pretty brutal. Now, when they were in range of infantry support, now when the Confederate infantry was in range of Union infantry, these guys rose up and opened fire on the Confederates, taking them down one after another. But still, the Confederates just kept on coming. And there was also a spar, which many historians designate as the high watermark of the battle and the war. Now, that spot was the Angle. Now, three of Pickett's generals was Kemper, Garnett, and Armistead. And they were coming up to take the Angle. And Garnett himself would be killed in action. Though his body wasn't identified, Kemper himself would be wounded. Now, Armistead would continue to lead the assault, and he would put his cap or his hat on the tip of his sword and urge his guys forward. Now, seizing a gun from a Union cannon, from Union artillery, during the charge, he would be wounded in the fight. And thus, at the stone wall, there was a brutal hand-to-hand melee up there. Now, hand-to-hand melee during the Civil War, these guys basically used musket butts, fighting knives, bayonets as thrusting weapons. They would also use their fists, their feet, anything. It was pretty brutal. And knowing there was no cavalry to support them is because a Wolverine by the name of George Armstrong Custer delayed the Confederate cavalry and forced them back. In other words, Pickett's charge failed. It was also there, as the Confederates were retreating, Union troops began chanting, "Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg." As Union troops celebrated, it was Fredericksburg, but in reverse. Now, mind you, back in December of 1862, Fredericksburg was a disastrous Union defeat because on Marye's Heights, just outside Fredericksburg, Union troops were slaughtered from the 11th to the 15th because of Burnside. And on July 4th was Independence Day, the Confederates left, vanished. They retreated back to Richmond to lick their wounds and continue to fight another day. And yes, Independence Day was a somber day for both sides because they lost a lot of men and knew they couldn't attack the North again. And thus, the Battle of Gettysburg ended in a Union victory. It was sometime later in November of '63, Abraham Lincoln, who was president at the time, came up to Gettysburg to dedicate the new cemetery. His speech, called the Gettysburg Address, which became famous to this day, it's to dedicate not only the Union men, but also the Confederate men and those who gave the last full measure of devotion in that time of need. Although Gettysburg was a Union victory, the war would continue on for 2 more years, with Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Now, since the Civil War ended, many people flocked to the historical battlefields where some of the men fought and died. They visit areas like Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Bull Run, Vicksburg, and even Gettysburg. Now, mind you, I've been to Gettysburg twice. I even talked about Gettysburg before. I mean, I've been up there once before. I was up there for a night before our vacation to Ocean City, Maryland, and the other when the Pope was in town. I really loved that time up there. And as for Gettysburg, its legacy is still carried on in any form of media, in artwork, songs, books, and even in movies. Now, in the 1990s, Hollywood came to Gettysburg to film a movie based on Jeff Shariah's novel. Now, I read one of Jeff Shariah's novels when I was in high school, called The Killer Angels, which was adapted in a movie called Gettysburg, which was one of the movies that began my love for the American Civil War and my fascination of the war as a whole. And also, Gettysburg is a really fantastic place, a lot of history, and I highly recommend you check it out because it's a wonderful place, a lot of history, and it's to dedicate the brave men and boys who fought and died at the Battle of Gettysburg. Oh, speaking of which, a civilian was also killed in that battle as well. That civilian was the name of Jenny Wade, was killed by a stray bullet. Now, no one knows who killed Jenny Wade. Was it a Union soldier? Was it a Confederate? We don't know. Oh, speaking of which, it's also haunted too. Gettysburg is one of the most haunted places in America because the souls of both Union and Confederate still roam the battlefield to this day. I should know because I watch a lot of paranormal investigating shows like Ghost Hunters and even my favorite show, Ghost Adventures, because these guys took part in the recreation of a battle. Zach Bagans, Nick Groff, and Aaron Goodwin, they were dressed up as federal soldiers and they experienced what the war was like. And they even investigated spots or paranormal hotspots in the town of Gettysburg. One of them was the Jenny Wade house. True story. Now, I've never seen in Civil War ghost soldiers. I mean, it would be cool to see them though, but maybe someday. And yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. And now at this time, I'd like to give a moment of silence for the brave Union men who fought and died at the Battle of Gettysburg. And now I'd like to give a moment of silence for our Confederate fallen at Gettysburg. Well, that was fun. And yeah, that's it for this video. And thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like this, please feel free to leave a like, a comment, and subscribe to my channel, and turn on the bell notifications so that way you can be notified when I upload the next video. And as always, this is Lego Mega 96 1 signing off.